I never thought of myself as someone who snapped. That was always the thing people said about me, that I was steady, patient, the kind of woman who could sit through a 2-hour meeting where her own ideas were being presented by someone else and still manage to smile when it was over. My mother used to say I had the temperament of still water, and for most of my 34 years on this earth, I took that as a compliment. Still water runs deep. Still water doesn't splash on you, doesn't make a mess, doesn't cause a scene. I kept that identity close, wore it like a second skin. I was the woman who stayed calm. Her name was Deanna Marsh. She had been at Calloway Fitch Insurance for 11 years when I arrived, and she made sure you knew it within the first 5 minutes of meeting her. Not by saying it outright. Deanna was far too calculated for that, but by the way she moved through the office, the way she let her heels click a little harder on the tile near the cubicles, the way she'd glance at your desk as she passed, and let her eyes linger just long enough on whatever you were working on to make you feel like you were doing it wrong. She was a senior account coordinator, I was a mid-level claims analyst, and those two facts were the entire architecture of her worldview as far as I was concerned. My name is Renata Webb, and I'm going to tell you about the day I became someone I didn't recognize, and why I've never once regretted it. I started at Calloway Fitch in the spring, transferred from the Memphis office after my divorce. I needed a fresh start, and the Nashville branch had an opening, and my supervisor in Memphis, a good man named Harold, wrote me a recommendation that apparently made the hiring manager cry a little, his words, not mine. I came in with 8 years of experience, a clean record, and absolutely zero interest in office politics. I just wanted to do my work, keep my head down, rebuild my savings, and figure out who I was going to be in the second chapter of my life. Deanna noticed me on the first day. I don't mean that she welcomed me or made an effort to introduce herself. I mean she looked at me the way a cat looks at something that has wandered into its yard, not threatened exactly, but deeply, fundamentally annoyed by the presence. She introduced herself briefly when our manager, Carol, brought me around for the team introductions, and her handshake was the kind that communicates hierarchy in 3 seconds. Firm enough to be professional, quick enough to be dismissive. She said, "Welcome to the team," with the warmth of someone reading a legal disclaimer. I smiled. I thanked her. I moved on. For the first few weeks, it was subtle. The kind of thing you notice but can't quite report because the words on their own are technically fine. It's the delivery, the timing, the audience that makes them something else entirely. Deanna had a gift for that. She could take a perfectly ordinary sentence and load it with exactly enough condescension that everyone in the room felt it except, theoretically, the person who might complain about it. The first time it happened in front of others, I was in the break room heating up my lunch, and she came in with 2 of the other women from her side of the floor, Priya and Gwen, who weren't bad people but had clearly learned that it was easier to float in Deanna's orbit than to resist it. I was stirring my soup and she walked in and said, loud enough for both of them to hear, "Oh, Renata, are you still figuring out the Archer account system? I saw you had some questions in the shared folder." She said it with a smile. She said it like she was being helpful. But the emphasis on the word still was a needle, and the phrase "I saw you had some questions" was meant to let me know I was being watched and found lacking. I said, "Thanks, Deanna. I think I've got it sorted now." Still water. She said, "Great. Just let me know if you need help with anything. Sometimes the learning curve here is steeper than people expect." Another smile. She turned to fill her coffee mug like the matter was closed. Priya caught my eye for just a fraction of a second. Not long enough to mean anything, but long enough for me to understand she had seen it. Over the following months, the pattern became clear. Deanna had a method, and she was consistent with it. She targeted things that couldn't easily be defended without sounding thin-skinned. She questioned your competence in front of just enough people. She offered help in tones that suggested pity. She redirected your contributions in meetings with phrases like, building on what Renata was starting to get at, before restating your exact point more confidently and collecting the nod from Carol. She forwarded emails with brief comments like, looping you in since this might be above your bandwidth right now. She used the word interesting as a weapon. That's an interesting approach. Renata meant you were wrong, and she was being charitable about it. I kept my notes. I am a claims analyst. Documentation is my entire professional language. I started keeping a running log in a personal notebook, dates and times and exact words, not because I was ready to do anything with it, but because writing things down kept me sane. It gave me somewhere to put the slow burn.
And it was slow. I want to be honest about that.
It wasn't every day. There were weeks where Deanna mostly ignored me, which was almost a relief. There were days she was perfectly civil, and I would wonder if I had been reading too much into things, if maybe I was too sensitive, if maybe the divorce had left me porous and raw in ways that made everything feel sharper than it was. Then she would do it again, and I would remember that I was not imagining it. The woman who worked next to me was named Farrah Okonkwo. Farrah had been at the Nashville branch for 3 years, and she was one of those people who is effortlessly competent in a way that makes them seem effortless in general. You had to watch closely to see how hard she was actually working. She was 31, sharp, funny in a dry way that snuck up on you, and she had 3 plants on her desk that she talked to sometimes when she thought no one could hear. I liked her from the first week. We started eating lunch together around month 2, and by month 4 she was one of the people in my life I trusted, which is not a category I expand quickly. Farrah had her own history with Deanna. Not the same as mine. Hers had started earlier and had a slightly different texture. Deanna's issue with Farrah seemed to be that Farrah was good at her job in a visible way, and visible competence in other women was something Deanna treated as a personal affront. She handled Farrah the way she handled me, except with a longer history and therefore a slightly more elaborate set of tactics. Shed questioned Farrah's numbers in a quarterly meeting once, and when Farrah had produced her documentation and been right, Deanna had said, "Well, at least we're all on the same page now," as if the confusion had been mutual rather than manufactured. "I don't let her see it get to me," Farrah told me once over lunch, peeling an orange with focused efficiency. "That's the one thing I will not give her." I told her I felt the same way. We were both still water. The incident happened on a Thursday in November. We had a department-wide project review that afternoon, which Carol ran quarterly to assess workflow bottlenecks. It was the kind of meeting that was genuinely useful. Carol was a fair manager who solicited real input and actually acted on it, which was rarer than it should have been. Around 12 people were in the conference room, including Deanna, Priya, Gwen, Farrah, 2 of the analysts from the north end of the floor, and a couple of the account managers. Farrah had been working for 2 weeks on a revised intake process for complex claims, a workflow redesign she had researched carefully, piloted on 3 accounts, and documented thoroughly. It was good work. I had read her summary document and told her so honestly. She was nervous about presenting it, not because she doubted the work but because she knew Deanna would be in that room, and presenting anything in front of Deanna was like walking across a floor you knew had weak boards. You didn't know exactly where the problem was, but you knew it was coming. The meeting started at 2. Carol went through the standard agenda items for the first 40 minutes. Farrah was scheduled to present her process proposal near the end, which I knew had been eating at her all day. When Carol turned it over to her, Farrah stood up. She always stood to present, said it helped her think, and pulled up her 1-page summary on the screen. She walked through it calmly and clearly. The new intake process reduced the initial processing time on complex claims by an estimated 22%, which she could demonstrate with the 3 accounts she had run it on. It required a modest adjustment to the current shared filing structure, which she had already mapped out. She had a transition plan. She had a cost-zero implementation path. She had thought of everything. When she finished, Carol said, "This is really solid, Farrah. I'm impressed. Does anyone have questions or feedback?" There were a few seconds of silence while people looked at the summary on the screen. And then Deanna said, "I do have a question." She had her pen in her hand, clicked it once. "Farrah, walk me through the logic on the complexity tier classification, because looking at this, it seems like you've essentially recreated the system we tried in 2019 and moved away from for reasons that are probably in a file somewhere if you'd had a chance to look." The room went very still. It wasn't a question. It was a suggestion, delivered as a question, that Farrah had done redundant work out of ignorance. The phrase "if you'd had a chance to look" was carrying most of the weight. It implied that someone more experienced, someone with better habits, someone more like Deanna, would have done that background check and not wasted everyone's time. Farrah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I saw it because I was watching for it. I did review the 2019 system, Farrah said, keeping her voice even. The tier structure is different in several key ways, which are outlined in Section 3 of the documentation I circulated before this meeting. Right, Deanna said, nodding slowly, in a way that made it clear she had either not read it or was choosing to treat its contents as debatable. I'm just thinking out loud about the sustainability question because what I remember from 2019 is that the system looked good on paper but required a lot of manual oversight to maintain, and I wouldn't want us to adopt something that ends up creating more work downstream.
She paused.
But I'm sure you've thought about that. That last sentence.
I'm sure you've thought about that.
Said with just enough of an upward inflection that it functioned as a doubt. Farrah said, the maintenance burden is actually addressed in the transition plan. It's lower than the current system.
Said Deanna.
She made a note on her pad, an actual written note, as if she were documenting a concern. I just want to make sure we're not solving one problem and creating 3 others. You know how these things can look great in a controlled pilot and then behave differently at scale. She smiled. That particular smile she had, helpful, patient, faintly sorrowful. I was sitting 2 seats down from Deanna and directly across from Farrah, and I saw something change in Farrah's face. It wasn't anger exactly, it was exhaustion. The specific, particular exhaustion of someone who has explained herself correctly and completely and is being told through tone and implication that correct and complete is not enough, will never quite be enough, because the goal was never to assess the work. The goal was to make her look uncertain in front of the room. Carol was about to say something. I saw her open her mouth. And that was when I heard my own voice. I did not plan it.
I want to be very clear about that.
I am not the kind of person who performs spontaneity. This was actual spontaneity, the kind that bypasses whatever filter you've spent decades constructing. One moment I was sitting there with my hands flat on the table, and the next moment I was speaking, and the thing about it was that my voice was completely calm. That was the part that surprised me most afterward. I thought if I ever snapped I would sound shaky or sharp or emotional. I did not. I sounded like myself, just without the usual careful editing. I said, "Can I ask a clarifying question about what just happened?" The room shifted.
People looked at me.
Deanna looked at me with an expression that was surprised and not entirely sure what to make of. Farrah presented documented, piloted, evidence-based work, I said. She circulated the full documentation ahead of this meeting. The concerns you just raised, Deanna, the 2019 comparison, the scalability, the maintenance burden, those are all specifically addressed in the documentation that was available before we walked in here. So my question is whether you read it, and if you did, why we're treating those sections as if they don't exist. The silence in that room was a different quality of silence than before. I kept going because apparently once I started, I was going to finish. I ask because I've watched this happen several times now. Farrah presents work. The work is thorough. And then the conversation gets redirected to questions that the work already answers, which means we spend the meeting relitigating things that are already resolved rather than actually evaluating what's in front of us. That's not a useful process, and it's not fair to the person presenting. Deanna said, "Renata, I'm not sure what you think I am not finished," I said. I did not raise my voice.
I want to be clear about that too.
I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward aggressively. I did not wave my hand. I sat very still, and I spoke at the same volume, and I said, "I'm not finished." And something about the steadiness of it made Deanna stop. "I have been in this office for 7 months," I said. "In those 7 months I have kept my head down and done my work and not said anything because I told myself it wasn't my place and it wasn't my fight and things would even out on their own. I was wrong to do that. What I should have said months ago is that the way you speak to the women on this team, the way you frame questions to make people look uninformed, the way you qualify other people's contributions as if they're close but not quite, the way you offer help in a tone that implies inadequacy, is not a management style. It's not a personality difference. It's a pattern, and it has a cost, and I should have named it a long time ago instead of hoping it would sort itself out." Deanna had gone very still. Her pen was on the table. Her expression was the expression of someone who has been perfectly comfortable being a bully for a long time because no one has ever named it out loud in front of an audience, and who is now recalculating something. Carol said, quietly, "Renata, not in a reprimanding way. More like she was checking in. I looked at Carol. I know this isn't the agenda item, I said, and am sorry for derailing the meeting. But Farrah's work is excellent, and she deserves to have it evaluated on its actual merits, and I think that's possible if we can agree on some ground rules for how these presentations go. Carol looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked at Deanna. Then she looked around the room, at Priya and Gwen, who were both studying the table, at the analysts from the north end who were very carefully neutral, at Farrah, who was standing very straight and very still behind her presentation. Carol said, I think we're going to take a 10-minute break. The room broke. People stood up, gathered their notebooks. Some of them went to refill coffee with the focused energy of people who want to be in motion, because being in motion means they don't have to decide what their face should be doing. Farrah came around the table and stood next to me and didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, so quietly only I could hear it, you didn't have to do that. I said, I know. She said, thank you. I said, I should have done it 5 months ago. When we reconvened, Deanna was quieter. Not chastened exactly. Deanna was not the kind of woman who chastened easily, but recalibrated.
Contained.
She asked one more question about Farrah's proposal, and it was a genuine question this time, a real one, and Farrah answered it, and Deanna said, that makes sense, and that was the last of it. Carol approved Farrah's proposal for a full implementation pilot at the end of the meeting. 2 days later, Carol asked to meet with me privately in her office. I went in prepared for anything, correction, context, a request that I handle things differently next time. Carol was a fair manager, but she was also a manager, and I had disrupted a meeting and named a colleague's behavior in front of the team, which was not the conventional way to handle these things. Carol closed her office door and sat down across from me and said, how long has this been going on? I told her I had kept notes. I pulled out my phone and showed her the log, dates, times, specific wording, context. Carol read through it without saying anything, scrolling slowly, and when she handed my phone back, her expression was careful and even. She said, I want you to know that I have suspected something was happening for a while, but I didn't have specifics. What you've given me here is specifics. She paused. I should have looked harder. I told her I didn't think it was her job to catch everything. She said, it's partly my job. That's the part one have to sit with. What happened after that wasn't dramatic, which I think is worth saying because the resolution of this kind of story is usually dramatic in the retelling, and the reality is usually quieter. Carol met with Deanna. I don't know exactly what was said. I know it included HR. I know it included the documentation. Deanna was not fired, and she was not demoted. What she was given was a formal documented conversation and a performance improvement framework that included, specifically, language about professional communication standards and equitable contribution practices. I know this because Carol told me, not in detail but in outline, because she thought I deserved to know that the conversation had happened and that it had been taken seriously. What changed was harder to measure than an official outcome, but more real in the day-to-day. Deanna stopped. Not all at once, and not entirely. There was a period of about 2 weeks where she was visibly working out how to be in the same space as me, recalibrating, but the comments stopped. The loaded questions stopped. The qualifying smiles, the pointed pauses, the editorial notes to self in meetings, they stopped. Not because she had changed her opinion of me or of Farrah, I don't think. But because the things she had counted on, the silence, the tolerance, the assumption that no one would say anything out loud, had been removed from the equation.
The calculus changed.
Priya came to my desk a week later, when Deanna was out of the office for a training day, and said, I want you to know that I'm sorry I didn't say anything earlier. Her voice was careful, like she'd been rehearsing it. I told myself it wasn't that bad, and I knew it was that bad. I told her I understood. And I did. I had told myself the same thing for 7 months. She said, what you did in that meeting, I've been thinking about it every day since. I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded. The thing I kept coming back to in the weeks that followed was the question of why it took so long. Not in a self-critical way exactly. I had my reasons, and they were the ordinary reasons that most people have, the ones about keeping your job and not making enemies and waiting to see if things resolve on their own, and wondering if maybe you're the one reading things wrong. Those reasons are real. They're not excuses, They're just the real calculation that real people make when the cost of speaking is unclear and the cost of silence feels manageable. But I thought about all the times I had sat in meetings and felt it happening and told myself it wasn't my place. I thought about the way Farrah had said I have been working at this office for 3 years, and she had been absorbing the same thing for 3 years, and it had cost her something, some daily expenditure of energy that she was so practiced at hiding that even I, who sat next to her and considered her friend, hadn't understood the full weight of it. I thought about Priya, who had clearly known it was wrong and had made the calculation that silence was safer, and who was now walking around with the low-grade weight of that. And I thought about Deanna, not with sympathy exactly, but with something adjacent to understanding. The kind of person who runs that particular game does it because it has always worked before. Because everyone around them has always made the same calculation. Because the silence confirms, over and over, that the behavior is acceptable and the costs of speaking exceed the costs of absorbing. It is a system that requires the compliance of everyone in the vicinity, and the moment that compliance is withdrawn, the system breaks down. It doesn't need a formal complaint or a dramatic confrontation or a firing. It just needs someone to stop complying. Out loud, in front of people, without apology. I was not a hero.
I want to be clear about that.
I was someone who had finally run out of patience at a specific moment, in a specific room, when the alternative was sitting there and watching someone I liked get smaller in front of me. It was not courage so much as it was a kind of unbearable friction. The friction of watching and saying nothing had finally exceeded the friction of speaking. Still water, my mother always said. But still water, if you heat it long enough, doesn't stay still. Farrah's proposal went into full implementation in January. The complex claims processing time dropped by 19% in the first quarter, which was close enough to her projection that Carol mentioned it specifically in the team meeting. Farrah received a written commendation in her file. She said she was going to frame it, and I told her she absolutely should. We still have lunch together, Farrah and I. Most days, when neither of us is buried. We don't talk about Deanna. There's not much to say. She's still there, still at her desk, still senior account coordinator, still, as far as I can tell, fundamentally herself. We work in the same space and we manage it. The sharpness is gone. The edges are covered. Something changed in the architecture, and everyone lives inside the new version now. The thing I think about most is not the meeting itself. It's not Deanna's face when I said I'm not finished, though that memory has a particular texture I don't expect to lose. It's what Farrah said to me 2 weeks later when we were eating lunch and she was peeling that orange she always brings, and she said, not looking at me, looking at the orange, I think I forgot that it was okay to be defended. I think I had been in it so long I stopped expecting it.
I didn't say anything right away.
The break room was mostly empty. The refrigerator hummed. I said, I should have done it sooner. She said, you did it. And that, I think, is the whole of it. You do it when you do it. You wish you had done it sooner. You resolve to do it sooner next time if there is a next time, because there is always someone in every workplace who has decided that a certain kind of woman is going to be their target, and the thing they count on is the math working out in their favor, the silence of the witnesses, the tolerance of the room, the steady, patient, careful stillness of the water. I am still a steady person. I still have my mother's temperament mostly. I still sit through difficult meetings without visibly flinching. I still document, and I still measure, and I still think twice before I speak once. But I am done heating up slowly and calling it strength. Some things deserve a boiling point. Some moments are waiting for someone to stop being still. I was that someone on a Thursday in November in a conference room in Nashville because Farrah Okonkwo had done exceptional work and I had a voice, and the only thing stopping me from using it was a story I had been telling myself about who I was. I told myself a different story. Am not finished.